sheltered a wounded Comanche boy. 3 days later, his father arrived with 50 warriors at dawn. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty plains of the frontier. Eleanor stood at the edge of her small, modest homestead, gazing out at the wide-open land. The wind had a bite to it, a reminder that the seasons were changing. It was a lonely place, far from the bustling settlement in the valley. The town, with its murmurs of tension between settlers and the native tribes, seemed a world away. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. The clopping was steady, almost rhythmic, but the rider was not like any settler she had seen. Eleanor tensed, her hand instinctively brushing the rifle hanging by the door. She had heard rumors about skirmishes between the settlers and the Comanche people, but she had never seen one of them up close. As the rider drew nearer, she saw a small figure slumped across the horse, barely staying upright. The horse was weary, its coat covered in dust, but it still moved with purpose. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The figure on the horse was a boy, a young Comanche. Eleanor stepped forward, her boots crunching against the dry earth. She had no idea why this boy was here or how he had arrived, but one thing was clear. He needed help. She waved her arms to catch his attention, and the boy's horse slowed, coming to a stop just in front of her. Eleanor looked at the boy, who seemed to be no older than 15. His face was pale and his clothes were torn, stained with what looked like blood. His eyes were barely open, his breathing shallow and weak. Without thinking, Eleanor rushed to his side. She gently helped him down from the horse, holding him steady as he collapsed against her. His weight was more than she expected, and she struggled for a moment before guiding him to the porch. "Stay with me now," she whispered, her voice filled with urgency. She didn't know what had happened to him, but she knew one thing. This boy wasn't just a stray. He had been through something terrible. Eleanor took him inside and laid him on the small cot in the corner of her cabin. She could see the deep gash on his leg and the dried blood around it. The wound was infected, and the boy's fever was climbing. She grabbed the medical supplies she had, bandages, antiseptic, a small bottle of herbs that she used for healing. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound and wrapping it carefully. His breathing steadied a bit, but he remained unconscious, his face flushed with fever. Eleanor sat by his side, watching him closely. She could feel the weight of the decision she had just made. Helping this boy, a Comanche, was a risk. The settlers would never understand, and if anyone found out, it could mean trouble. Big trouble. But something about the boy's plight struck her. He wasn't just an enemy. He was a child, injured and alone. As she sat there, the sound of the wind outside grew louder, almost as if it were trying to tell her something. She had always been strong in her own way, but this felt different. A part of her feared what might come next, but she couldn't turn him away. Hours passed and the boy remained unconscious, his breathing slow but steady. Eleanor had just finished stoking the fire when she heard the faint sound of a horse approaching. She froze, listening intently. Was someone coming to check on her? She had been careful to keep a low profile, but this could be trouble. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Eleanor moved quickly to the door. She peeked outside but saw nothing. Whoever it was had already passed, leaving only the sound of the wind in its wake. The night stretched on, and Eleanor remained by the boy's side, her mind racing with questions. Who had done this to him? Why had he been left for dead? And what would happen when his people found out he was here? The boy had spoken little since his arrival, and Eleanor couldn't understand the few words he had muttered under his breath. But one thing was certain. He had been hurt in a fight. His injuries told the story of a struggle, of something far bigger than a simple skirmish. The settlers and the native tribes had been at odds for years, and things had only gotten worse since the arrival of the colonial forces. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about survival. She couldn't let herself get caught up in the politics. She had to focus on the boy. She needed to keep him alive, to get him through the night. As dawn approached, she made a decision. She would hide him for as long as she could. If the settlers found out, they might want to take matters into their own hands. But Eleanor couldn't ignore the fact that this boy, despite everything, needed her. She could only imagine what his father would think if he found out his son had been abandoned like this. She had no idea what the future would hold. But she knew this much. Her life in the frontier was about to change forever. The boy's eyes fluttered open as the first rays of light crept through the cabin. He blinked a few times, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. There was a brief moment of recognition, followed by confusion. "You're safe now," Eleanor said softly, trying to ease his fear. She knew he didn't understand her words, but she hoped the tone of her voice would offer some comfort. The boy shifted slightly, looking down at his leg and the bandages. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Why?" he said, his eyes flickering with something like recognition but also fear. Eleanor leaned closer, not understanding the word but sensing its importance. "Who is Waya?" she asked, her voice low. But the boy, exhausted and still feverish, didn't answer. His eyes closed once more, and he fell into a restless sleep. Eleanor sat there for a long time, her thoughts swirling. The word Waya echoed in her mind, and the name carried a weight she couldn't explain. She couldn't help but wonder if this was a sign of something bigger, a warning, or perhaps something she couldn't yet understand. The day passed slowly. Eleanor kept watch over the boy, tending to him as best as she could. She knew it wasn't enough. His condition wasn't improving, and she needed help, but where could she turn? The settlers in town would never forgive her for sheltering him, and the risk of being discovered was high. Just as evening fell, she heard the sound of hooves again. This time, it was closer, much closer. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest. She wasn't sure who it was, but she had to prepare herself for whatever came next. The Comanche boy stirred once again, his eyes opening briefly. "Waya," he whispered again, his voice even weaker than before. Eleanor paced back and forth inside her small homestead, her mind racing with worry. The sun had set, casting the room into a soft golden glow from the dying embers of the fire. The Comanche boy, Tanka, still lay on the cot, his face flushed with fever. He had drifted in and out of consciousness, but his condition was not improving. Eleanor knew she needed help, but asking for it felt like a risk she could not afford. She kept thinking of the word he had whispered, Waya. She didn't know who Waya was, but something about it felt important. The boy's father? A leader? The name lingered in her mind, but it made little sense. She had no way of understanding the full story without the boy speaking to her directly. Still, Eleanor's instincts told her she needed to protect him at all costs. Outside, the wind howled, bringing with it a cold chill that crept through the cracks in the walls. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned back to the boy. He had calmed down a bit since earlier, his breathing slower and more regular. But Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before his fever rose again. She had to make a choice. If she stayed here, alone with him, there was a chance no one would ever find out. But if his people came looking for him, it would mean trouble. Not just for her, but for the whole settlement. She couldn't be sure, but she suspected that the Comanche tribe would not be forgiving. After all, the settlers had taken so much from them already, and this boy was a part of that struggle. As if on cue, there was a sharp knock at the door. Eleanor froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who could it be at this hour? She moved cautiously toward the door, glancing back at Tonka, who still lay unconscious. His condition was fragile, and she didn't want to risk any sudden movements waking him. With a steady hand, she opened the door just a crack, peering outside. Standing on her doorstep was Sheriff Dalton, his face as grim as ever. The sheriff was tall, broad-shouldered, and always looked like he was prepared for trouble. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, scanned the interior of the cabin before focusing on Eleanor. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Got a moment?" The sheriff wasn't known for making friendly visits, and tonight of all nights was no exception. She forced a calm smile. "Of course, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" Sheriff Dalton leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've heard talk, rumors, really, about a boy. A Comanche boy." She knew exactly where this was going. She tried to keep her face neutral, but she couldn't hide the anxiety that filled her chest. "Is that so?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice trembled slightly. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "Some of the folks down at the saloon said they saw a boy on horseback yesterday. They said he was Comanche. You know anything about that?" Eleanor's mind raced. She needed to lie, to make him leave before things got out of hand. But she also knew the sheriff was sharp, and he wouldn't be easily fooled. He had been with the town for years, and he knew everyone's business, whether they liked it or not. "I haven't seen anyone," Eleanor said quickly, trying to sound confident. "I'm just here on my own, Sheriff. Maybe someone else is mistaken." Dalton studied her for a long moment. She could almost feel the weight of his suspicion bearing down on her. The wind howled again outside, but inside it was deathly quiet. "Maybe," he said, his voice taking on a different tone. "But you've got to understand, the settlers are getting nervous. We've had enough trouble with the Comanche already. If there's a boy out there, and he's hurt, well, people are going to start asking questions." Eleanor nodded, her mind spinning with possibilities. If she didn't tell him the truth, it could cost her. but if she did, it could mean the end of everything she had worked for. "Sheriff, I'm just trying to live a quiet life," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know anything about a Comanche boy." The sheriff looked at her for a moment longer, then slowly took a step back. "All right, I'll let you be for now. But I'm keeping an eye on things, miss. You know where to find me if you change your mind." Eleanor didn't say anything. She just nodded, the weight of the sheriff's visit settling heavily in her chest. She closed the door quietly, locking it behind her, and leaned against the wood, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her gaze turned to the boy once more. Tanka remained still, but his fever was higher now. Eleanor knew that time was running out. She couldn't keep him here forever. The sheriff would be back, and soon others would come too. There was no way she could hide a wounded boy for long. She had to make a decision, and it had to be fast. That night, as the wind howled outside and the fire in the hearth burned low, Eleanor sat by Tonka's side, her mind torn between two worlds. On one hand, she felt a deep sense of compassion for him. He had been abandoned and left to die by those who should have protected him. But on the other hand, she knew the settlers would never forgive her for sheltering a Comanche boy, especially one who had been hurt in a skirmish with their own people. As the hours passed, Eleanor found herself lost in thought. The boy needed help. But could she be the one to give it to him? Could she protect him from what was coming? In the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn began to peek over the horizon, Eleanor heard it again, the distant sound of hooves. Her heart skipped a beat. This time, it was louder. Closer. She rushed to the window, her pulse racing. In the distance, a rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it now. This rider wasn't alone. The figure on horseback was joined by others, dozens of others. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she counted the riders, each one moving with purpose, as if they were on a mission. The Comanche had come for their own. Eleanor's heart sank. The boy's father, Waya, had arrived, and with him came 50 warriors. The sun was barely visible over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the plains. Eleanor stood by the window, her hands trembling as she watched the approaching riders. Her breath caught in her throat as she counted them. Dozens of Comanche warriors, all riding toward her cabin. The wind carried the sound of hooves in the distance, growing louder by the second. Her heart pounded in her chest. At the head of the group, Eleanor could make out a tall figure on horseback. His posture was commanding, his presence undeniable. She didn't need to see his face to know who he was. Chief Waya, the leader of the Comanche tribe, had arrived. Eleanor's mind raced. The boy, Tonka, had been found by his people. She had known this moment would come, but she had never imagined it would happen so quickly. The chief's arrival could mean trouble for everyone. The settlers would not take kindly to seeing Comanche warriors so close to their land. A conflict was inevitable, and Eleanor feared for her life, and for the boys. The warriors rode in tight formation, their faces grim and determined. As they approached her homestead, the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself was waiting for the inevitable clash. Eleanor's thoughts raced. What would she do? How could she protect Tonka, a boy who was caught between two worlds, neither of which seemed to want him? She took a deep breath and turned to the cot where Tonka still lay, his fever rising once again. His eyes were closed, his body limp, but he stirred slightly, as if sensing the change in the air. Eleanor's heart tightened. She knew she couldn't keep him hidden forever. The warriors would search her cabin, and if they found him... But Eleanor couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let Tonka be taken away. The bond between them, though short-lived, was undeniable. She had cared for him when no one else would, and now it was her turn to protect him. Eleanor quickly moved to the back door of the cabin, trying to think of a plan. There was no time to waste. She had to get Tonka out of here before the warriors arrived. The last thing she wanted was for the chief to find out that his son had been sheltered by a settler. The consequences of that could be disastrous. The hooves grew louder, and Eleanor knew the warriors were nearly at the cabin. She glanced back at Tonka, who was still barely conscious. She couldn't carry him far, but she had to try. She rushed to his side and gently shook him awake. "Tonka!" she whispered urgently, her voice shaking. "Wake up! We have to leave!" "They're coming." The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze locked onto hers, confused but trusting. He didn't understand her words, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Slowly, he nodded, as if accepting the inevitable. Eleanor grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders, then helped him sit up. He winced, clearly in pain, but he didn't protest. His condition was still fragile, and he was weak, but she had no choice. She had to get him to safety. The warriors were getting closer, and Eleanor could hear them calling out to one another in their native tongue. It was only a matter of time before they reached the cabin. She had to move quickly. With Tonka leaning heavily against her, Eleanor moved as fast as she could, guiding him through the back door and into the thick woods behind her cabin. She knew the land well, having lived here for many years, but she had never ventured this deep into the forest. The trees provided some cover, but it wouldn't be enough to hide them for long. The warriors would follow their tracks if they wanted to. "Stay with me, Eleanor," urged quietly, glancing over her shoulder. Tonka's breath was ragged, but he kept moving, stumbling at times, but never faltering. Eleanor had to be strong. She couldn't let fear stop her now. They moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them. Eleanor's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen if they were caught. Would the Comanche tribe punish her for helping their wounded? Would the settlers come after her too if they learned of her actions? Either way, she was in danger. As they moved deeper into the woods, Eleanor's thoughts turned to Chief Waya. She had heard stories about him, the fierce leader of the Comanche, a man who would do anything to protect his people. He was known for his strength, his determination, and his unwavering loyalty to his tribe. But she also knew that he was a father, and fathers would do anything to protect their children. What would Wyatt do when he found out that his son had been taken in by a settler? Would he see her as an ally, or would he see her as an enemy? Eleanor didn't know, but she was about to find out. The trees began to thin out, and Eleanor's pace slowed. She looked around, trying to find a place to hide. There was a small creek nearby, its waters running fast and cold. It could provide cover, at least for a little while, but she didn't know how long they could stay hidden. Eleanor guided Tonka toward the creek, helping him kneel by the water's edge. She could feel the urgency in her bones. The warriors would be searching for them soon, and they would never stop until they found him. She crouched down beside the boy, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You'll be safe here," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. "Just stay quiet. I'll keep you safe." Tonka nodded weakly, his eyes closing again. He was exhausted, his body trembling with fever. Eleanor had done all she could, but she wasn't sure it would be enough. She could only hope that the warriors wouldn't find them, at least not before she had a chance to figure out what to do next. The sound of hooves reached her ears once again. The warriors were getting closer. Eleanor felt her heart race. She could see the dust rising in the distance, and she knew it wouldn't be long before they reached the creek. She turned to Tonka, her voice low but firm. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Eleanor stood, her eyes scanning the woods around her. She had to find a way to mislead them, to keep them from finding the boy. She wasn't sure how long she could keep him hidden, but she had to try. As the warriors approached, Eleanor's thoughts turned to Chief Waya once more. Would he show mercy on her if he knew the truth? Or would he see her as an enemy, a settler who had taken his son? The weight of the unknown hung heavy in her chest, but she had no choice but to face it. She couldn't run forever. Eleanor crouched low behind a thick clump of bushes, her heart pounding in her chest. The sounds of hooves grew louder, the warriors closing in on the creek where she had hidden Tonka. The boy's fever was high, and she could feel the heat radiating off his skin. But there was little she could do now except pray he would be safe, pray that the Comanche would not find him, or worse, that his father would be forced to take action against her. She knew this was a dangerous game. The moment she had taken Tonka in, she had signed her fate. But Eleanor was a woman of strength, and no matter how scared she felt, she would stand firm. She couldn't back down now, not after all she had done for him. The warriors rode past the creek, their eyes scanning the area with sharp precision. Eleanor held her breath, praying they wouldn't notice the tracks leading to the water. She had done her best to cover their trail, but the soil here was soft, and it didn't take a trained eye to spot fresh signs of movement. A small figure broke through the trees, his face serious and determined. Chief Waya had arrived, and with him, 50 warriors. He rode at the front of the group, his posture proud and commanding, his gaze sweeping across the land with the authority of a leader. Eleanor's heart stopped for a moment, and she instinctively took a step back, deeper into the brush. The chief dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He spoke in a low voice to one of his warriors, who nodded and moved off toward the trees. Waya's eyes swept the area, scanning the ground, his gaze finally resting on the creek. For a long moment he stood still, as if listening to the whispers of the wind. Eleanor held her breath, hoping he would not sense her presence. She could feel his power in the air, like a storm building on the horizon. As the chief moved closer to the water, Eleanor's mind raced. Should she reveal herself? Should she confront him now, before the warriors had a chance to search any further? She glanced at Tonka, who lay still by the creek, barely able to keep his eyes open. He was too weak to run. If the warriors found him here, they would take him, and she would be helpless to stop them. But just as Eleanor began to rise, a voice called out from behind her. She is here. The voice was steady and calm, but there was a tension beneath the words. Eleanor turned slowly, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Tanka. The boy had gotten up from his resting place and staggered toward the chief, his legs unsteady but determined. Eleanor watched in shock as he approached Waya, his head bowed low in respect. The chief's gaze softened, and he extended a hand, pulling Tonka into a tight embrace. Eleanor hesitated, unsure of what she should do next. The warriors had not noticed her yet, but the reunion between father and son was unfolding before her eyes. She felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The boy was safe for now, but the consequences of her actions had not yet played out. Tonka's voice was weak. Tonka's voice was weak but clear, the words coming from a place of trust. Waya looked at Eleanor for a long time, his dark eyes piercing through her. For a moment there was no sign of anger or judgment, just a long silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Eleanor stepped forward, heart in her throat, unsure of what to expect. You took my son in, saved him when none would. Waya's voice was low, heavy with the weight of his words. I do not know if this is a kindness or a mistake, but you did it. You saved him. Eleanor swallowed hard. I only did what I thought was right. He needed help. The chief nodded, his face unreadable. The warriors around them murmured quietly, their attention split between their leader and the stranger who had taken in one of their own. Eleanor's stomach twisted with anxiety. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her, but she had no idea what they were thinking. This land has been stained by too much blood, Waya said, his voice quieter now. The settlers have taken much from my people. They have killed and destroyed, and now they are coming for what is ours. What is left? Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had seen the damage, the bitterness, the mistrust between the settlers and the native tribes. The hatred ran deep, and it would take more than one act of kindness to heal the wounds that had been made. But you helped my son. Waya's voice hardened slightly, but there was no malice in it. You did not act out of greed or fear. You acted from the heart, and that I will not forget. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. Was this forgiveness? Or was it something else? She had no way of knowing, but she felt the tension in the air, the weight of the decision that hung between them. Waya looked at his warriors who had formed a loose circle around them. He raised his hand, signaling for them to stand down. The warriors reluctantly complied, their expressions still cautious, but they obeyed their leader. Waya turned his attention back to Eleanor. You will leave here now. His words were not an order, but a request. The settlers will not understand. They will come looking for my son. You cannot stay here and face them alone. Eleanor nodded, her chest tight. I understand. But where will I go? What will I do? You will go to the mountains. Waya's gaze softened. There is a place there, hidden from the eyes of men. My people will take you in, protect you. But you must leave now. You cannot return to your home. Eleanor hesitated. She had never imagined leaving the only place she had ever known. But she also knew that staying here would put both her and Tanka in danger. If the settlers found her harboring a Comanche boy, they would see it as a betrayal. She had no choice. She had to leave. I will go. She said it with resolve, though her heart was heavy with sorrow. She had given everything for Tonka, and now she would have to give up everything else. Her home, her life, her safety. Waya looked at her one last time, his expression still unreadable. Then go quickly. We will watch over you from afar. But remember, the price of mercy is never easy. There is always a cost. Eleanor nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She turned toward Tonka, who was still leaning against his father. The boy's face was soft with gratitude, but there was a sadness in his eyes that she could not ignore. He was torn between two worlds, between his father's tribe and the settlers who had raised him. But at least now, he had a chance to return to his people. Thank you, Tanka whispered, his voice trembling. Eleanor reached out, pulling him into a tight hug. Stay safe, Tonka. Remember what I told you. You're stronger than you think. Tonka nodded, his face buried in her shoulder. For a moment, they both held on to the connection they had formed in the brief time they had spent together. Then, as the first light of day broke across the horizon, Eleanor turned and began to walk away, leaving behind everything she had ever known.